Attending a virtual career fair doesn't have to be tough. Your employers deserve to be heard too. Don't take a chance on those relationships. Give them the virtual fair experience they're asking for. Give them better. Choose a partner. Career Fair Plus.
All right, Clarissa, I will turn it over to you and we can go ahead and get our webinar started.
Well, fantastic. Thanks everyone for joining us today on behalf of the Employer Relations KG. We're really excited to have this conversation today. I am Clarissa Tejeda. I serve as the Associate Director of Career Services at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. I want to give a special shout out to our Assistant Program Coordinator for Webinars, Katina Rains, who represents the Georgia State University. She serves as the Employer Relations Coordinator. She actually connected us with Roderick, which I know is going to provide some wonderful insight. I've been waiting to hear your content today. So Roderick, the floor will be yours. Just a reminder, we will be gathering the Q&A throughout the session, so feel free to go ahead and use the chat, if not the Q&A feature on Zoom. And the session will be recorded and placed on the SOACE website, so you can go ahead and share it with other colleagues. Again, this is an important conversation that I'm glad we're able to have today.
Thank you so much, Clarissa, for the wonderful introduction. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Very excited to give this presentation today on the Employee Diversity Card in Action and how career centers can impact social change. Before I get started, I do want to state that it really is me. So this picture here is, that's my representative of what I used to look like the pre-COVID days. And then I discovered that my hair still can grow. And so I let it grow. And so this is who you're speaking with today. But that really is me at once upon a time. And so to get started, I would like for everybody that's on the video call today to put the following information in the chat so I can know who's out there, and we can also just know who is joining us today. So put your name, who you work for, and your LinkedIn URL so that we can network with each other and make some meaningful connections while we are giving this presentation today. I always think it's important when we have so many, people on a call and so many, with so many different experiences, that we take advantage of the opportunity to connect and build relationships that you can take advantage of after the presentation. So I'm going to jump right in because I know that time is limited, and I want to make sure that I leave enough time for Q&A, but also to get through the content for today's presentation. So just a little outline, and this is basically what the description of the presentation is today. Is really talking about these what's happening today, what's been happening in the past few years, but what's really been heightened in terms of awareness and activity when it comes to how leading employers are tackling systemic racism and social injustices, really not only just locally and nationally, but all over the world. I also want to talk about the DEI and social justice strategies, and you'll hear me put those together when I talk about DEI and social justice strategies, but how they're being implemented and what are some of the ways that these organizations are looking at impacting the socioeconomic status of people that are in any of these underrepresented, underserved, and marginalized groups. And finally, how can career centers respond to these intentional changes in corporate activism and citizenship? And what does it mean for the type of programming and initiatives that people that work in career centers can uniquely champion to better support students belonging to these groups? So a lot to pack in, but I'm going to make sure that it goes smoothly. And my objective today is not to have all the answers, but to spur questions and to help all of us think collectively about how we can use our position in career services to take a cue from how organizations are impacting some of these systemic challenges and be able to do a little more for our students as well. So I want to go over the DEI scorecard, aka the Anti-Racism and Gender Equality Scorecard. And I don't know if you were able to attend any of the presentations I've given on this before or watch any. I'll give a high-level overview just so you understand, how this framework is put together, what are some ways it can be used, and give you a little context of why this piece and where we sit in the career services allows us to really have a dual role on how we support our students and their professional outcomes. So one of the things I look at is, using this puzzle approach and really looking at, you think of employers and most companies, most of them use some iteration of a balanced scorecard. And, a balanced scorecard framework, I've got it listed over here in the right column as you see, so I'm not going to read through everything. But if a balanced scorecard framework allows an organization to really be able to meet their strategic objectives by taking holistically everything into account that's going to serve their customers, right? So they look holistically from the bottom up and saying, okay, hey, from the people to the processes to our profit, what are all those little things that need to be done at a high level in order for us to be successful? So you've got this balanced scorecard framework that organizations typically ascribe to, no matter how big or small they are, they'll describe to some iteration of that, right? Then you have your equity scorecard that is more prevalent in higher education and academia. So if you're not familiar with the equity scorecard, basically what that's looking at is, when we talk in terms of underserved and underrepresented student populations, it's looking at, what type of access do these students have to either particular academic programs that lead to, high-paying careers. It can be access to internship opportunities, access to career services, access to scholarships, any number of things. Then retention is what it is. Okay, how do you measure, the dropout rate, so to speak, in certain courses or certain majors or certain activities, and what are the factors that go into retaining when you start looking at these disaggregated demographic breakdowns. And then institutional receptivity is looking at what is your staff makeup and how does it reflect the demographics of these underserved student populations that you're serving. And then finally, the excellence perspective, right? So that's looking at, high academic achievement and what factors go into that. So when you take those two, you take the academic, equity scorecard and the corporate balanced scorecard, you see that they connect to what we call our community. And that's where these entities and organizations lie. And this is what I alluded to further earlier, where we talked about local, national, international. Employers and universities, they are a part of the community. They're not apart from it. So it's important to keep that in mind because the socioeconomic and racial injustices, the community is where a lot of these things are coming from, right? So wherever that community is, these things are prevalent there. That's where you see them. And then everything around that is trying to mitigate or eliminate those inequities, right? So you have to understand the role of the university that it plays in, hey, how do we support first generation students or low income students or students that are transgender or what have you, any students from racial, ethnic, underrepresented groups that historically have some type of disadvantage or, when you look at the data, there's some, glaring inequities in terms of achievement or access or outcomes. And then the same thing holds true in corporate, right? So when you look at organizations and what I alluded to earlier, when organizations are now saying, hey, we've got to do a little more, we've got to take more of a social justice role, but the governments can't handle. So we've got to do this now. We've got to do things to make sure we have a fair workplace. We have to make sure that as you look at the top, numbers of our workplace or just the demographics of our workplace and senior leadership, is that reflective of where we operate? It is reflective of our workforce. Even if it's not reflective, what potential barriers or roadblocks are in the way for people to achieve success when you start disaggregating data? And so you have these pieces of the puzzle. And then you have to look at, okay, so where do we fit in as career services? And what is our role? And this is where the scorecard, the Anti-Racism and Gender Equality Scorecard, was designed to help career center professionals have that framework to really be able to say, okay, when I'm talking to employers, when I'm evaluating employers, I have a means now, a standard process, as it were, to be able to clearly articulate the information that I want to either gather from this organization or discuss with this organization as it pertains to this framework, right? And so when you look at this framework, it's color coded. And as you see, I love colors. So I'm going to color code everything if I can. I just like bright colors. It's just who I am now. But when you look at, this framework, I want you to think of it from a bottom up approach, and meaning starting from the bottom, like a ladder, so to speak. I even refer to this as a ladder type of logic. But you want to start from the bottom and think about, when you're looking at an organization, understanding what that community and social impact perspective is, and understanding what are they doing within a community across these areas, right? And then you move on up to the other levels within this framework, which are looking at employer branding and recruitment perspective. This is the area where typically career services is going to operate. Then you go and turn into the organization, which is retention and advancement. And then finally, people and inclusive leadership. So if you do your work at the bottom, so to speak, and if you think of this as a bottom-up approach, if you put in your work as an organization at the bottom, it doesn't mean you're not working simultaneously or in parallel at these other levels of the framework. It just means that you have to understand that you can get some diminishing returns, or you can be working against yourself if you're not laying the right foundation. And that foundation is the work that you consistently do in a community that has a social impact on the very customers or clients or shoppers, choosers, users, however you want to frame the people that support your organization. You've got to look at, hey, how are we impacting these people, and what role do we have to make sure that they're not, barriers that could be keeping one group for being as effective or participating in activities over another group, right? And so these organizations are looking now more at, hey, what can we do? We have a role to play. We can't just turn a blind eye and say, hey, our role is just to make profit. That was more of the shareholder capitalism view. And now if you keep up with a lot of business trends with the business roundtable, now they're moving more towards, in the past couple of years, a stakeholder view. So a stakeholder, what they call stakeholder capitalism, basically. So now they are taking into consideration more of the people, right? Taking into consideration planet, of course, and they're taking into consideration, the employees and people that have a voice that, impact or affect how the organization does business. And so that's why you're seeing this move for a lot of these leading employers to say, hey, we've got to do something, because they're getting those calls from these stakeholders that are apart from shareholders, right? We think of shareholders, you're thinking of people that are usually not so much associated with the company outside of just financial investment. So they don't really care a lot of times as long as the company makes money. However, that viewpoint doesn't really resonate with today's generation. And so your leading companies have picked up on that trend, and they're moving towards this direction of really saying, hey, we have a greater responsibility. And this is not just about profit, but it's also about impacting, making a healthier and more whole and more just society where people will flourish, and by default, our organizations will flourish. So I want you to think of this as a bottom-up approach when you're going and say, hey, how does the community and social impact perspective impact an organization's employer brand and their ability to recruit? How does an organization's employer brand and ability to recruit talent impact their ability to retain and advance that talent? If we're thinking through the lens by historically disadvantaged groups or any other disadvantaged group that you yourself want to identify or research. So this is not lockstep set in stone that you only have to look at the groups that I have defined, but this framework is designed for you to adapt it for your own reality. And then finally, when you think about how does your ability as an organization to retain and advance this talent, this underrepresented talent, how does that now reflect at the top of this ladder, which should reflect when we look at your demographics, when we look at your people and what I call people in inclusive leadership perspective? Because now I'm saying, okay, if I start looking at your workforce data, if I start looking at your management and leadership demographics, if I start looking at your board of directors, if I start looking at how the people that you select to even be in the talent pool for succession management, how diverse and how reflective is that pool to even allow for change at the top echelons of your organization? So I wanted to go over that just to help you make sure you understand how everything fits together. Now, when I developed the scorecard, so I looked at several frameworks, Added Scorecard, I looked at, of course, the equity scorecard, I looked at several strategic frameworks like SWOT, gap analysis, because I wanted to make sure everything fit together. I wanted to make sure that there was an alignment in terms of using this as a strategic framework. So it wasn't something that was just apart from all these other frameworks, but something that you really could fit in like a puzzle, like a little Jenga puzzle. But also look at it from a psychological standpoint, you have to understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you probably say, man, how does this fit in there? Well, the similarity is when you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's that bottom-up approach as well. And so you think about satisfying those basic needs first before you can get to this point of self-actualization. And so those similarities there, that's what I want to call attention to, because the way I designed this scorecard, similar in that framework to where you have to take care of, if you really want lasting change and not just transactional change, you have to make sure you're doing the things at the bottom of this ladder very well, right? And it's not an overnight thing, it's an investment, it's a journey, it's a process. And then you get to this point of self-actualization, which is your people and inclusive leadership perspective. So this point of self-actualization that you would have for an individual is, oh, wow, now I've arrived. Now I can concentrate on the finer things in life. Now I can just concentrate on me. Now I can take music lessons. I can go skydiving. Now you can think of all that because you're not worried about basic needs, not worried about in deployment space, microaggressions. You're not worried about these kind of hidden barriers that are keeping you from fulfilling your purpose from a professional standpoint. That's how this ties in, and from an organizational standpoint, look like this. Trying to understand what are those things that, as an organization, they have to do, or and that you, as a career center professional, need to be able to converse with them about, clearly assess them on, evaluate, and understand how they're going about, managing these processes to make sure that they're removing these barriers or identifying potential barriers that could negatively impact specific demographic within an organization. So this is the scorecard more fleshed out, and so I call this it's more of your now dashboard version if you want to look at it from that perspective. And now all of those component parts, those key performance indicators, now they're fleshed out. And so now when we talk about Roderick, what do you mean by employee, workforce demographics, or what do you mean by employee engagement and well-being? Now you see those KPIs broken out into 3 component parts. Each one is broken out into 3 component parts. And so, for example, if we're looking at, an organization's onboarding strategy, what are we specifically talking about, right? If we are looking at their volunteer and pro bono program, what are we specifically talking about, right? If I'm talking about succession management, I alluded to that earlier, and I want to know the demographics on that, or if an organization is even tracking that, what does that mean? Okay. Career pathing programs, if you're familiar with that term, and really looking at how people advance throughout an organization. Is it lockstep? Are there formalized programs? Is it informal? Is it more who you know? But understanding, within that process, are there any promotion biases? Who gets promoted, right? Does an organization even track that? We look at pay equity bias. Is a company tracking that? So a lot of the leading companies do. So if you look at their data and look at the information they make transparent, they do track, pay equity and gender pay equity in particular. And they're trying to get to that point of parity. And the transparent ones will show you where they are. And then, finally, I have on here race gender bias, but what that is pertaining to performance appraisal bias. And so when we're talking about performance appraisal bias, what you're looking at is, if you disaggregate the data by race and gender, are there any I would say inequities or any kind of just glaring differences if you base it on race and gender? Like, so if you're looking at, wow, it looks like people of this race, looks like consistently their performance evaluations are, let's say out of 5, it's the best 2.2 or something. But people of this race, it's like 3.7. Or male versus female, it's like, from a gender standpoint, it's like there's a huge disparity. Like, why is that? And so you're able to have these conversations with organizations. And when organizations use this framework internally for themselves, independent of a career center, because the way this framework is designed, it's designed for both employers to use internally, for them to manage their own DEI and social justice initiatives, but also for a career center to be able to use as a framework, be able to have those conversations, know what questions to ask, as well as being able to educate students on what questions to ask, what things they should be looking at when they do evaluate specific companies, when they do get down to, between 2 or 3 companies, or even when they're just trying to understand, hey, which companies am I even interested in? Do I even want to look at based on what's important to that particular student or that particular group And so you have this framework now where you can help guide your students, but you can also help guide your career center, whether you're on the employer side or the student facing side. And so I talk about this, retention and advancement perspective here. I want to highlight this because when you look at how this framework is, well, the bottom two, you look at community and social impact, and then the employer branding and recruitment, these things are external to the organization. With employer branding and recruitment, it has an external and internal component. It's where that transition takes place. There's a part of it that's external because there's a point to where the person or people that you want to recruit are not inside your company yet. And so that's still when it's external, like, hey, what are we doing to even attract and get these people, right? And then that's that transition point where they do become employees, and that's where it then connects into the third level of the ladder, which is the retention. So there's a significant part of that employer branding and recruitment perspective that is still external, and then the community and social impact that is external. And then you have your retention and advancement and people in inclusive leadership that are purely internal. So now these are internal to the organization. This is what the organization uniquely controls. You as a career center professional, you no longer have any control. You no longer can do anything here, right? Until now. And so what I'm arguing is that while these organizations, are within their right to say, hey, we got it from here. Like, thank you for helping us find the talent. Thank you for creating the events for us to be able to recruit, talent at your university. But once we hire them, we got it from here. We're good. We no longer need your services. And most of the time, we no longer offered our services. For us, it was like, hey, we've done our jobs. So we've helped connect, the talent with the employer. And once the deal was sealed, it's on to the next, right? That's been the typical, cadence of how we've operated within career centers. And so this just kind of gives another demographic of graphic of what I talked about in terms of external and internal. But you can even set that up on the SWOT analysis, and you can look at internally, when the organization is thinking about, hey, what are our strengths and weaknesses when we look at our retention and our people in inclusive leadership? Because if you know a SWOT framework, your strengths and weaknesses are internal to your organization. Your opportunities and threats are external. And so I set it up on a SWOT framework as well. So from an organizational perspective, they're able to say, hey, what are our opportunities and threats if we're looking at the bottom half of our ladder? And what are our strengths and weaknesses if we're looking at the top half of our ladder? Now, on the right side of this slide here, when again I go back to this connection between the university, the community, and the organization, the employer, and I want to center that within that education, entrepreneurship, employment, and economic mobility. And I'm going to come back to that, but I want you to keep that in mind, because when we start thinking about social impact, when we start thinking about what career center professionals can do to begin to impact, socioeconomic mobility of the students which we serve, this framework is what I want you to think about. And so all of this, when we're looking at the inequities, we're saying, hey, where do these inequities come from? Where do these inequities, show up? Well, they show up in entrepreneurship, they show up in employment outcomes, and they show up in economic mobility. So that's why it's important to remember those 4 E's and make sure you center those. And then you're looking at that through the lens of the historically disadvantaged groups, because otherwise you won't see inequities, you won't see the gap. So that's why it's so important to be able to look through that lens. And then what I have here is saying, hey, no longer just looking at individual interventions, now looking at ecosystem solutions. And that's what I mean about, looking from a community perspective, employee perspective, and academic perspective. So let's look at some examples. So, I've talked about, these organizations, these companies, what are they doing, in the communities now, how are they moving beyond performative acts, to really make a huge social impact, and put more, I said, the money where their mouth is now, right? There was always something that was missing in the past in general, or it would be these kind of transactional, hey, one time, let's just put a little money here just to placate people. But something really changed last year, and you really see that there's more of a commitment, and that really is a credit to the internal employees of these organizations demanding that their organizations do something and really be visible in doing it. and also potential, stakeholders for those organizations also, demanding, but all of it is based on the people. So when people start saying, hey, this is important to me, I want to work for an organization that's out there doing something about an issue that I feel strongly about. And so here's what you see. So I want to show you a highlight of JP Morgan Chase. They do a lot in the US, but I want to show something they're doing in London, so in the UK, just to show you how this is a global movement. It's not just something where it's just about the US, but organizations even that are US based but global, but even some that are non-US based and that are in other countries that also are really beefing up their corporate citizenship and what they're doing from a social responsibility standpoint. Bank of America, you may have heard Bank of America. They have always been strong in DEI work, and they really have put a lot of money into supporting colleges, but they've also put billions of dollars into supporting banks and access to loans for underrepresented small business owners, and to really looking at a lot of these systemic challenges that have faced certain groups in this country. Price Waterhouse is another one of my favorites. They're actually a co-founder, the CEO for diversity and diversity and inclusion. And so they have this $3 billion digital upskilling initiative that they're working with professors at historically Black colleges and universities. Microsoft, if you look at what they're doing, and they're doing a lot of things. I couldn't put everything that they're doing, but you look at just the investment and money that they're making and how they're trying to target that money and how they're trying to use that money to really make some changes. And then finally, Lowe's, listen to a podcast from their CEO and what they're doing. They created this almost like a Shark Tank type of event where they had small businesses be able to come up and pitch opportunities to them, pitch products to them that they could put on their shelves, because Lowe's said, hey, we have a responsibility to the community, and if we can support small business owners and we're able to strengthen our community. So these are those examples that I talked about in terms of how organizations are stepping up. And these are the big boys, so to speak. So these are ones that are leading the charge, but by no means are they the only ones. And so you don't have to have $1 billion or $1 million. In some organizations, they're committing a lot of time. So they're using their volunteer hours of their employees as an asset, and they're targeting those volunteer hours to specific, nonprofits or social, enterprises to be able to mitigate or undo a lot of these harms in society. So kudos to a lot of these companies. But again, coming back here and trying to make sure that we, as we speak about these companies and these organizations, and eventually what we can do as career center professionals, thinking about through the lens of historically disadvantaged groups, and however you want to define them, specific to where you are within your universities or your colleges, but always thinking in terms of how does something impact education of these groups, entrepreneurship, employment, and economic mobility. Okay. Now, the emphasis is usually on employment, right? So when we start thinking about us as career center professionals, we typically emphasize employment, because that's what we get rated on. That's what students want. That's what parents expect. That's what the universities expect. So nobody's going to say that you're against employment. That's just where our focus is. That's how we justify, our work, our output is how well are we able to help students reflect and think and navigate careers and think about what they want to do, whether that's going to graduate school or whether that's starting a company or being prepared to go work for any of these employers in any industry. Usually that's where their emphasis is on. Most of our programming is geared towards that. But I always say there's another, and this is where we get into moving beyond the transactional and getting more into the transformative and extending not only our career services brand, but also extending our reach in terms of how we support our students. So how can career centers, impact social change? And so I wanted to look at that from two different perspectives. So they're first at it from an internal perspective. And this is something I wrote about. And basically, this goes back to, transparency and accountability. And when I talk about transparency, basically what we're talking about is your communication strategy, right? And when we talk about accountability, we talk about your management strategy. Because accountability, you have to have a management strategy to be able to achieve whatever goals you have set out, laid out to achieve. And so basically when we talk about these things, you have to ask yourselves, what are we doing in this space? How transparent are we with the data on our own internal program? And so I challenge career centers to even understand where they are, because before you can even talk about, hey, how are we going to impact social change, you first have to say, hey, what are we currently doing? What do we know about students that we serve, and how transparent is that data? Are we just aggregating that data? Is transparency prioritized in our office, right? And so, for example, if you look at your career education workshops or your career fairs or your job shadows or any type of event that you as a career center facilitate, point where you are consistently disaggregating the attendance data or participation data of those students, right? Just to know, okay, what does this look like? Are we getting, good representation from our student body, or does it look like only one type of student or one particular demographic seems like, wow, they're really taking advantage of our resources, but for whatever reason, we noticed that some of these other groups are not really taking advantage of the resources, reflecting, as reflective of their percentages here at this campus, right? And this could be on a race, it could be gender, but it could be first gen, it could be, it could be veteran. It depends on how you track your data or the access you have to track it on that granular level. But it does help you to just understand where you are before you can start saying, hey, we're going to jump into, trying to impact social change. You have to understand where you are. And this helps you to be accountable, because now once you look at this data, if you do identify some inequities or some areas that you can improve, now the next step comes, okay, do we have the resources to actually do something about it? Or now maybe this data allows us to justify getting some additional resources to tackle some of these inequities. And then who else needs to be involved in this? So this is not just the Lone Ranger anymore. This is not the, Michael Knight from Knight Rider, one man can make a difference. No, it's like you have to now form coalitions across campus, because you can no longer just say, hey, the career center has to do it all by themselves, because that's the problem at some campuses I've talked to. The career center is seen as kind of apart from things if it's not well integrated. But it's like, hey, when it comes to jobs, just let the career center people take care of it. They'll handle it. But it's really an integrative approach, okay? Now when we look at, going back to that bottom-up approach I talked about, and this, again, this framework here helps you from a strategic standpoint to see how is everything connected together. And so I want you to think of this ladder logic approach from the career center perspective, right? And so you start saying, okay, well, I see this framework. What does it mean? Okay, so typically the career center's line of sight is at level 2. And this is the employer branding and recruitment perspective. Because what that means is the employers are recruiting, and they're recruiting at our campus. So this is where we operate. We operate at level 2 because we're connecting with those employers and connecting them to our students and other stakeholders on campus, okay? So that's typically our line of sight, and that's where that transaction takes place in terms of recruitment, hiring and all of that. But once they're hired, typically we lose sight. And the only sight we have is what we get from FDS surveys, but that's lagging, data lagging indicators, but it's more of just to know what was that outcome, right? So it's more the transactional. But where we actually need more insight, instead of the current line of sight, we need more insight into what happens to these students once they get into levels 3 and levels 4 of the organizations, right? So how many, career centers on this, call today can say that they consistently have have insight into what happens with their students, in a formalized way? Now, you would get evidence anecdotally, depending on relationships you built with students. They may reach out and say, hey, this is what's going on, and hey, just want to check in with you, let you know how I'm doing at ABC company. It's not formalized in a way that you can run any diagnostics or demographics, just to understand what happens to the students on a more detailed level once they leave the university, once they graduate and go into these companies. And this is actually where it's most important going forward, as I argued that we had to have this new call and we have to move more towards this transformative relationship with companies and say, hey, we actually do want to know more about your internal processes. Yeah, we want to know, do you have DEI training and unconscious bias training? And hey, what is your CEO's position on this? And what type of training do your managers and coworkers get on XYZ? And how do you identify high potential talent? And how do people get into upper levels of leadership within your organization? And what are you doing about this low number in terms of representation at your senior level? Like, now we have to start asking those questions. And you have to have this framework to be able to put you on the same level with your counterparts in these organizations, so that they know you know what you're talking about and you know the right questions to ask. And now you are at a level where you can be more of an advisor, and in some cases even consulting. So this is what I argue for levels 3 and level 4, where we need to start moving to. And so real quick, I put this little dashed line here to say, hey, this was just an imaginary barrier. It was always there, but it's just an imaginary barrier because most of the times we didn't have the need to feel like we needed to go further and figure out, hey, organizations, what exactly are you doing? We just need a little more information. So nobody was telling us we couldn't do it. It just wasn't really part of our purview. And it wasn't something that was written in stone in your job description to do. So if it was done more ad hoc or more because of your career-centered strategy, but most certainly it wasn't formalized in any actual sense. So now we move to this. Let's talk about external, right? So let's talk about what are we doing from a career center that can impact change external to our career centers. And this is, when I talk about external, I'm talking about operating up in levels 3, levels 4. Okay, so now we're moving to levels 3, levels 4. That's what I mean by externally. And so I talk about how does it positively impact the socioeconomic status of people in underrepresented, underserved, and marginalized groups. And I want to bring your attention to this, principles of social justice. And this is just a definition I just got offline. I put the website there, but I like that definition and paid attention to the access part and equity and participation. As well as human rights, you can throw that in there as well. But in terms of our role, how do we make sure that the students, when they go into these workplaces, once they leave us, what is our role in making sure that there's some equity in how their professional careers are being managed and handled? And so I argue these 4 points. I say, hey, how cool would it be if you could track underrepresented alumni up to 3 years out on career progression? So bear with me here. Now, this is being done at some universities. Typically, this is done at MBA schools. I used to work in MBA career services. That's why I was born in, so to speak, when I came into the career services world. So that's all I knew for like the first 15, 17 years of my career services life. That's all I knew was that MBA space. And we data track everything. We were like and then there's a lot of rankings publications and accreditation authorities that they ask all these questions. They just raise the stakes every year. And so then the first 3 months after graduation, 6 months after graduation, a year after graduation, they used to just be the norm. Okay, we're good. Then they start saying, hey, you know what? We want to know 3 years after graduation. We're like, oh my God, 3 years out? We need to know that. So we had to reorganize our resources and processes and operation strategy, because now I said, well, we need to have a relationship and understand what these students are doing 3 years out, so that when we send a survey, or when these entities send a survey to whatever spreadsheet of contacts we send them, these students at least have some idea and some wherewithal to be able to answer these questions, right? And so this is what I mean about surveying these alumni, and then being able to look at that data that you get to look at some trends and patterns that you can talk to your employer partners about. They may not know these things, they may not, but this is particular to your university. So it's not something looking at national data, but really particular to your university students. And I know that the Career Leadership Collective does a lot of great work in surveying alumni as well. So that's a good resource for you to look at in terms of some questions that you can ask or partner with them on. And then finally, is once you get that data, how do you work collaboratively with your employer partners to then say, hey, everybody has an incentive to improve retention, right? Talk about 3 years out. No employer say, hey, no, we just want to hire you just for 6 months, 1 year, and we're good. Like, nobody's really saying that. Now, that may be a strategy for some companies, but most of them are not coming to your campus and say, oh no, we just want to, hey, if your students just work with us 1 year, 2 years, we are absolutely okay with that. right? They're not really coming with that mentality, but the reality is students may not stay, or graduates at that point may not stay for 3 years. So the 3 years out, it has to come with some nuances and with some context and with a grain of salt. But what you do want to be able to look at is if people are leaving the organization, why are they leaving? Okay, and understanding, are they leaving for better opportunities, or are they leaving because there was an incident? All right. And so when I talked about what is the other thing that career services needs to look at, or has to look at beyond just the employment outcomes, then the other thing is economic mobility. And this is what I mean by that. Like, how are the students, especially from these underrepresented groups and marginalized groups, how are they moving within your organization? So that in and of itself, that is the social impact. That is equity. That is looking at participation of opportunity. So if you want to do your part from a social justice standpoint, to do your part from a social impact, hey, help figure out where these students on the economic mobility scale once they leave your organization, versus just say, hey, they got a great job at XYZ company, they're good, but we don't really know that, right? And so that's the new calling. So I want to give you some ideas of just looking at what current practices are out there when we talk about tracking student employment outcomes. And this is mostly what we look at, right? So we're just saying, hey, are you employed, seeking, not seeking, did you go to grad school? So it's really tracking that type of data, and it's looking typically 6 months out when we talk about undergraduate institutions. But I realize some institutions may go further. I told you MBA programs, they typically have to maintain those relationships because they will be asked at some point to track 3 years out. So they've got to maintain those relationships a lot further. But that's a different type of value proposition, different type of program. So you can't compare apples to apples, but there are things that we can learn from those type of programs. And that's what I want to show you. This is another example. This is Northwestern. And again, they're looking at 3 months post-graduation where the students are. This is their MBA program, just so you see salaries and signing bonuses, think like, oh, what does that happen? But this is, their MBA program again. That things, this was undergrad here, but this is an MBA program just to show you they, typically track the same data, but they will at some point have to track further out. And then finally, I want to show you, this is the rankings publications from the Financial Times. And one of the things they look at they look at the 3 years out data. So just to show you in practice, where that comes from. So they looked at the 3 months out, like that's just par for the course. But they also, look at what's called the weighted salary. That weighted salary is based on, the salary today is based on 3 years post-graduation. So it's $195,000. That's not where a student in this school that this information is based on in Chicago, Booth MBA, it's not based on what they're getting at graduation. So just so you don't, feel like, man, I need to go back to school to get an MBA if I'm coming out and getting $195,000. But that's not an at graduation number. That's a 3 years out. So they're looking at saying, hey, where are your students 3 years out from a salary standpoint? And then you see these other questions they ask about, your career progress ranking. So basically asking students, what are some, career progressions that they've had based on, categories that Financial Times has. They also asked them how they rank their career services. They asked them, did they achieve their goals? And then they asked them, do they recommend, what are the 5 or 6, universities or programs they would recommend? So there's some things we can pull from this just in terms of thinking about what could we track 3 years out. Now, how do you start? So your next question is probably, yeah, it's all good, but where do we start? So what I say is you have to first identify your top, 25, 50 DEI employers, because until you do that, then you can just be chasing and running in the wind. And so I would identify companies that you already have a strong relationship with, and you can use the scorecard just to make an objective, exercise to say, hey, let me go through and objectively evaluate versus just gut, feel and all of that. But really looking at companies that have strong initiatives in that space, right? And through evidence and through all of these other things. And ones that you have good relationships with as well, because they're going to be more open to working with you. And then what you want to do is start saying, okay, asking these companies, most companies, I can guarantee they're tracking retention rate, right? So it's not something they don't do already. What you don't know is, which they should be, because they have access to all the data, asking would they provide that data to you disaggregated for your student. And you're not asking for everybody that they've employed. You're just saying, hey, would you provide that information historically for students that have come from our university, disaggregated by race and gender, so we can start working collaboratively together to see, are there any disparities? Or if they're not, hey, for you, it's a good job. We just want to do our part to make sure that we're extending beyond the first two levels of the framework I showed you, the scorecard. You also want to know how the organization looks at, what key factors are impacting the experience and retention of these, employees that's aggregated by race. And I'm talking about, student hires, again, these new hires. And so is the employee even looking at that? Do they even track those experiences as people leave the company, certainly when they're there, but when they leave the company, are they able to say, okay, are we getting some exit survey or exit interviews? Are we understanding why people are leaving so that if it's something internal to the organization, we're able to address it? And then finally, and this is by no means is this an exhaustive list, but then you want to be able to develop a way to work with that employee partner to improve those experiences and retention rate. And so this goes, again, deepening the relationships, deepening your role as a career center professional beyond the transactional. And so here I just list some companies that I listed before that are part of some of these top 25 DEI companies. Regardless of the campus they go to, they're just nationally known, but being able to ask some of those key questions to know what type of targets is the company trying to achieve, how do they plan for equity within their succession planning, what drives voluntary turnover for the historically disadvantaged groups. And I'll tell you, just based on, I create this framework, the scorecard, I've asked a lot of these questions to companies, and many are like, oh, we actually don't know. We don't track that. That's actually something we need to start doing, right? And so companies have come back to me and say, hey, thanks for just helping us to see like this is something we need to understand, because otherwise we just wouldn't know. And so they've gone through the exercise and they've looked at, hey, what do we need to do within our internal databases and resources to be able to start tracking this information. And finally, I want to show you the snapshot of, this is from McKinsey and looking at the status quo, so to speak, of a typical, corporate workplace. And, if you look at, how people come in from, entry level, and then how those percentages change as you get to the C-suite, what you typically see is, overrepresentation at one level, then, gross underrepresentation at another level, right? And so these are areas where McKinsey goes into some detail on this report on what leads to these inequities when you have these demographic groups coming to the typical corporate workplace. And so then my question becomes, to you, how will your career center change this narrative, right? So that's my question to everybody. And then that is it. That is the invitation. I thank everybody for sharing their time with me today. And now, if there are any questions, I want to leave a little time for some Q&A or to go back over any other material in the presentation I made today.
Thank you so much, Roderick. This was really insightful. I do appreciate how you really are trying to activate more than just employment, right? Again, the retention, the big picture. And if anyone has any questions for Roderick, go ahead and put it into the chat, if not the QA. Again, this session was recorded, so it's also going to be posted on the SOA site. I would love to know, again, this is going to be my totally selfish moment here, is how are students kind of also involved in this progress? How are you engaging them in the conversation with employers to make sure, again, that sounding board is active?
Yeah, it's a good question, Clarissa. So what we're currently doing, so I'm working with my counterpart in career services, and she leads the student-facing team and all of the career education workshops and everything dealing with programming related to one-on-one counseling and all of that. And so early on, I've been partnering with her and work with her to develop some workshops around this framework. And so that from the student perspective, they're able to say, what should you be looking at when, think about it like this. This framework, when you look at it from how it can be used in like myriad different ways. And so I'm very careful about trying to say, hey, just use it like this, because I want people to be creative in how they use it, similar to like a SWOT framework or any other strategic framework. But for career education workshops, you're able to use this framework to help students, understand what questions they could be asking and should be asking when they're in networking events, right? So they're networking with alumni or employer representatives. Certainly when they are preparing for interviews to begin, understanding, hey, what questions should I be asking from a research standpoint? Certainly during an interview, so to be able to know strategically which questions to ask based on ones that are important to you. And it will help you, just as I've asked these questions to employers when I'm talking with them, it just helps you to really see the difference it makes when you are prepared, when you have a framework, because now you're not just reaching and searching and say, okay, what should I ask? You have this framework and you just simply go by this guide and you say, hey, I'm more interested in your people and inclusive leadership. And that guide tells you, okay, what is the people and inclusive leadership? And as a student, you may just want to know, hey, I noticed that, let's say you only have, 2% representation of women and it's, X level of the organization. What are some things that your company is doing to increase that? Now you're going to have one or two things. Either the company rep is going to say, oh, wow, what a powerful question. I actually don't know. Or they're going to say, wow, thank you for asking that question, because here's some things that we're doing. And even in some cases, you may have a company say, actually, we don't have any plans, but thank you for bringing it up, because we realize this may be something, hey, this is something we need to look into, and maybe you're the person to help us to change that narrative. So either way, you as a student are going to be more powerful because you know the types of questions to ask, because a lot of times you don't know what you don't know. And so I didn't know, I wouldn't have asked these questions starting out in my career, but it's key now because it really does impact the trajectory of your career. And you wouldn't know that until you understand just how different the experience can be if you work at a company that has strong DEI strategies and initiatives, strong training for their hiring managers and other stakeholders within the organization, commitment to fair processes, to removing barriers, pay equity, all of them. You have to work at one of those companies first and then work at one that doesn't have that, or vice versa, either way, to understand the difference, right? And a lot of times you don't know that coming out of school. So us being in career services, having these workshops to be able to teach them and say, here are things that you could potentially face. However, here are questions that you can ask. Here's a framework. Here's where you can start researching ahead of time so that you can make an informed decision. Doesn't mean you don't take the job if you're offered it. It just means that you go in with eyes wide shut, so to speak. So where you say, okay, I know what I'm getting into. So now I know strategically what I have to do. I know I need to seek out mentors. I know I need to do this. I need to individually take on a little more responsibility for my career because they don't have the framework to support me like I would like. However, I see opportunity to build that skill myself or to do ABC, and maybe I can be the first to build that within this organization.
I completely echo Nadia's statement of it's been really impressive to see the development of the scorecard. Just so y'all know, Roderick actually was the 2020 SOACE Champion of Diversity Award winner, so he's done a lot of great work with that. And I will say I am really excited to actually implement a lot of those conversation starters with our employer partners, especially those smaller scale employers where maybe that hasn't been a part of the conversation just yet, the small business owner, and for scalability, the fact that they know they can come to career to offer that expertise. So kudos to you and the team. Again, a wonderful job. Again, his contact information is on the screen. If you do have to follow up, again, feel free to do so. This conversation is not meant to end here. And how do we continue it on, and how do we really activate wonderful talent across the nation? So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Thank you, Roderick, for your expertise and just passion towards DEI. I know you're going to do phenomenal work even coming up in the future.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, SOACE. Thank you to all the attendees today for just spending your time. I know a lot of us are zoomed out. We've been on webinar after webinar, and I know most people multitask while they're on webinars. I know, trust me, I've been there. So if you did pay attention and you learned something today, thank you. It's been my pleasure. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you on this new mission, on this new way that we can be more relevant to our students and do more transformative work beyond the transactional work of employment, but moving to keeping employment, but moving to economic mobility as well. And that's our social impact. That's, charity starts at home. If you want to make some social impact, look at your own students and your underrepresented students, however you define them. Clarissa and I were talking beforehand, and at her campus, she has a lot of first-gen students. And so, okay, how cool would it be to say, hey, yeah, we help these first-gen students get jobs, but what happens after they get jobs? We have a process to know how they're being treated within these organizations, and if they're satisfied within these organizations, because maybe there are some trends and things that we can pick up on and be able to work with those organizations to create a more inclusive environment and also improve any type of training and preparation for those students at the academic institution before they even leave.
All right, again, thank you so much. Let's get out there and make some lasting impact, right? So have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of y'all's week.